1874, midsummer, high noon. The sun beat down on the Arizona frontier like a hammer against an anvil. Heat shimmered off the cracked earth, and the wind carried with it a stinging veil of dust that scraped across skin and eyes alike. The small town of Dry Creek sat in the valley, its lone street half swallowed by sand, its wooden buildings weathered and splintered, its people hardened by drought and debt. At the edge of that street, a man stood with the look of one who had gambled everything and lost too much. Elias Crow, tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt faded from years of sun, his hat pulled low to hide the hollowness in his eyes, was known only as the poor rancher who'd buried a wife, sold his cattle, and poured his last coins into barren soil. His boots were caked with dust, his hands rough, his face carved by sun and sorrow. On this day, the town gathered at the makeshift auction block, a raised wooden platform where men usually sold cattle, rifles, or stolen goods. But today, something different, something darker was on display. Shackled in heavy iron, their ankles bruised and wrists raw, stood two Apache sisters. They towered over most men, tall and unyielding, their eyes sharp as obsidian knives. Their hair, long and black, whipped in the wind, and even in captivity, their stance spoke of defiance. The crowd jeered. Whiskey breath and tobacco smoke thickened the air. Bets were laid on how long they would last, or which outlaw would break them first. Elias watched, jaw tight, fists clenched, his heartbeat pounding louder than the auctioneer's shout. "Who'll start the bid?" The voice rang out, sharp as a whip crack. For a long, tense moment, no one answered. The sisters stared back at the mob with silent fury, as if daring them to try. And then, against every whisper of reason, Elias Crow stepped forward. His voice was low but steady as he raised his hand. "I'll pay." A hush fell over the street. Dust swirled. Men spat curses. A fortune laid bare for two women no one else dared to claim. But before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe for more untold Wild West stories. The desert sun still burned hot on Elias Crow's neck as he led the two Apache sisters out of Dry Creek. The air was heavy with dust, each step of their horses stirring small clouds that clung to skin and stung the throat. Behind him, the murmurs of the town still lingered like an echo, the curses, the laughter, the bets on how long before he lost his life or his land. But once the hoofbeats carried them past the last crooked fence post and into open desert, there was only silence. The sisters rode behind him, shackles clinking softly, their posture proud and unbroken. Elias could feel the weight of their stares drilling into his back. He wondered if they hated him more than the men in town, if they saw him as just another captor. His hands tightened on the reins. He had not bought them for ownership, nor to humiliate them. But the truth was hard. He had bought them all the same. The coins he had once saved for cattle, for the chance to rebuild his ranch, now lay in another man's pocket. What he had left was two strangers who had no reason to trust him. The land stretched endlessly rolling scrub, jagged rocks, and a sky so wide it seemed to crush a man's chest. The wind carried the faint cry of a hawk. Hours passed before Elias guided them through a broken gate into his ranch. The place looked like a skeleton of its former self. A collapsed barn, a dry well, a single corral half buried in sand. The small cabin, walls warped by sun and storms, stood crooked but alive. Elias dismounted, boots sinking into the dust. The sisters followed, their chains rattling with every step. He pulled a rusted key from his pocket, his fingers trembling as he unlocked their shackles. The iron fell away with a heavy thud. For a moment, freedom hung between them. The sisters' eyes burned dark, unyielding, and Elias braced himself, expecting them to strike or flee into the desert. Instead, they only stood taller, their silence sharp as a blade. "I got no wish to harm you," Elias said, his voice rough as gravel. "This place is yours as much as mine now, but it's all I got left." No answer came. One sister crossed her arms, her gaze unblinking, while the other looked beyond him at the dead fields, her jaw clenched in contempt. Elias turned away, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of their judgment. He walked toward the cabin, pushing open the creaking door, letting them follow if they chose. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dust. A single table, 2 chairs, a straw bed barely enough for 1 man, let alone 3. Elias set down a cracked jug of water, the last of his rations, and slid it across the table toward them. The sisters did not drink, though their lips were parched. They stood like sentinels, waiting. By nightfall, the desert turned bitter cold. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling loose boards, and the stars glowed hard and sharp above. Elias sat by the fire, his shadow flickering on the wall. The sisters huddled near but apart, their eyes reflecting the flames. For the first time, Elias felt the enormity of what he had done. He had brought them here, against their will, into a ruin of a home where even he barely survived. And yet there was no undoing it. His silver was gone, his reputation ruined. The sisters, bound to him by circumstance, were his burden now. Sleep came in broken fragments. Twice he woke to the sound of movement, soft feet on the floorboards, the whisper of a knife being unsheathed. Each time, he lay still, ready for the blade. But it never came. Perhaps they waited for the right moment. Perhaps they chose patience over blood. When dawn bled red over the desert horizon, Elias rose to find the sisters standing outside, their silhouettes framed against the rising sun. They were scanning the horizon, alert, watchful, like hawks perched on the edge of the world. For the first time, Elias realized something unsettling. Their captivity was not his choice alone. By taking them, he had placed himself in their hands. If he faltered, if he failed to feed or protect them, the desert would claim them all. And so the path was set, whether he wished it or not. Elias Crow had spent his fortune not on cattle, nor land, nor freedom, but on 2 women who carried with them the weight of a people and the wrath of a chief who would one day come to claim them. That night, as the prairie winds howled and the stars turned cold above the ranch, Elias sat awake by the fire, knowing there was no escape. He had chosen this road, and it would either bury him in dust or bind him to something far greater than himself. The days that followed turned Elias Crow into a man under siege, not by gunfire or Apache arrows, but by the scorn of his own kind. Word of his purchase spread like wildfire across the frontier, twisting with each retelling. By the time Elias rode into Dry Creek for supplies, the entire town was waiting with sharpened tongues. The saloon was the beating heart of the town, its swinging doors creaking under the constant shove of boots. Elias pushed through them, hat low, dust trailing off his coat. Conversations hushed for a moment, only to erupt again with cruel laughter. At the bar, a pair of cowhands raised their glasses. "There he is," one sneered. "The rancher who traded his herd for a pair of squaws." "Hell," another said, loud enough for the whole room. "Maybe he plans to marry both, make himself a king out there on his sand farm." The room erupted in jeers, whiskey sloshing, boots stomping. Elias's jaw locked, but he kept his eyes forward, ordering flour and beans from the barkeep. The stares burned into him from every corner, and behind each was a question: how long before he breaks? When he stepped back into the street, he found more than whispers waiting. A circle of men had gathered, dust swirling around their boots. Some carried shotguns, others clubs. At their head was a storekeeper whose voice carried the heat of the mob. "You bringin' them Apache women through town again, Crow?" the man barked. "You're asking for trouble. Folks don't take kindly to their kind mixin' here." The sisters stood by the wagon, eyes unflinching. Their beauty was fierce, unsettling to men who saw only enemies where Elias saw human beings. Elias placed himself between the mob and the sisters, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His voice was calm, though the muscles in his neck strained like ropes. "They're under my protection," he said. "Anyone wants to lay a hand on 'em will have to come through me first." A tense silence followed, broken only by the rattle of a shutter in the hot wind. Then the laughter came again, crueler this time. One man spat in the dust. Another raised his torch, letting the flame flicker close. The mob pressed forward, not with courage but with the blind power of numbers. And then an arrow struck the dirt between their boots, quivering in the dust. The crowd recoiled, curses ripping through the air as shadows appeared on the canyon ridge beyond town. Apache riders, dark and silent, their war paint glowing faintly in the dying light. They did not charge, did not shout, just watched. Watching was enough. The mob scattered, torches snuffed, men stumbling over each other to retreat. Elias felt the sisters at his back. He did not turn to them, but he knew their eyes were on him, studying his stance, the set of his shoulders. For once, the town's hatred did not drive them apart. It bound them, however loosely, against the storm. When Elias guided the wagon back toward his ranch, the sisters rode close, silent as ever. But silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of that moment, when the town had turned on them, and he had not stepped aside. That night, the wind carried laughter again, not from saloon men, but from coyotes on the hills. Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames, knowing the truth. Dry Creek would never forgive him. The whispers would grow, the mobs would return, and one day, whispers would turn to bullets. But for now, the ranch still stood, and the sisters remained. And in the vast darkness of the desert, Elias Crow wondered whether his enemies lived among the cowboys of Dry Creek or in the shadows of the Apache riders waiting for their chance to strike. The desert cooled to bone-chilling silence when night fell, and it was in that silence that something began to shift between Elias Crow and the two Apache sisters. Their distrust had not vanished, it clung to them like dust on skin, but the air was no longer sharp with threat. Small things began to take root. On the third evening after their return from town, Elias was repairing a broken fence post near the corral. His hands, blistered from work, slipped on the hammer, and the jagged wood tore his palm open. Blood dripped into the dirt. He muttered a curse and tied a rag around it, but the wound gaped wide. Without a word, one of the sisters crossed the yard. She knelt before him, her long hair falling over her shoulder as she unwrapped the rag. Her touch was steady, deliberate, not gentle, but sure. From a pouch tied at her waist, she drew dried herbs and pressed them against the cut. The sting was sharp, but Elias did not flinch. For the first time, her eyes met his without defiance, dark, steady, unreadable. That night, they sat around the fire together. Elias broke his bread and handed half across the flames. The sisters hesitated, then took it. As they ate, he spoke not of himself, but of the land, of the seasons that stripped a man bare, of cattle lost to drought, of a wife buried on the hill behind the ranch. His voice was low, roughened by grief. He did not expect an answer, but after a long silence, the elder sister spoke, her voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of loss. She told of soldiers who had come at dawn, torches and rifles in hand, of a village burning, of children scattered into the desert like ashes in the wind. Her words came in broken English, but the meaning cut clear. The younger sister added little, only nodding, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Elias listened, his jaw tight. He had known suffering in his own way, but theirs was carved deeper, older, carried in silence like a scar. And yet, around that fire, sorrow met sorrow, and something unspoken bound them. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. The elder sister carried buckets from the well, shoulders strong beneath the sun. The younger one tended the half-dead garden, coaxing sprouts from the parched earth with patience Elias had long lost. Together, they patched holes in the roof, mended broken tack, and brought life back to a place long left to rot. Elias found himself pausing to watch them, not as captives, not as burdens, but as women who brought resilience where he had found only failure. One evening, when a prairie storm swept across the horizon, the three of them took shelter in the cabin. Rain lashed the roof, wind howled through the cracks, and thunder shook the ground. Inside, with lantern light flickering, the sisters hummed a low, mournful tune. The melody was strange, haunting, like the sound of wind over canyons. Elias sat in silence, letting it wash over him, until his own voice, unpracticed and rough, joined in with a hymn he had once sung at church with his wife. For a fleeting moment, two worlds, Apache and settler, wove together in harmony against the storm. The next morning, the storm had passed. The land smelled of wet earth, a rare sweetness. Elias stepped outside to find the sisters already at work, hauling broken branches from the corral, their laughter soft and rare but real. He felt something stir in his chest, something he thought buried with his wife, the fragile thread of hope. By firelight that night, the elder sister studied him for a long time. "You fight your people," she said finally. Her English was broken, but her meaning sharp. Elias nodded, staring into the flames. "Maybe," he said, "but I fight for what's right." Fru. The words hung in the smoke, heavy, honest. For the first time, the sister's eyes softened, not with trust, not yet, but with recognition. In the quiet bond forged by shared labor, shared wounds, and nights beneath the endless desert sky, Elias Crow no longer felt the crushing weight of solitude. The burden was still there, but he carried it with others now. And that small change, fragile, unsteady, was enough to keep him standing when the winds of judgment and vengeance began to gather once more on the horizon. The warning came with the storm. By late afternoon, the sky had blackened to a bruised purple, heavy with thunderclouds that stacked high like mountains. The desert wind, usually dry and sharp, now carried the electric scent of rain. Elias Crow stood at the edge of his corral, hat pulled low, watching the horizon tremble with distant lightning. The sisters worked near the barn, their movements urgent, tying down loose boards and gathering tools before the tempest broke. Then, on the wind, came another sound different from thunder. Hoofbeats, many of them. The ground seemed to pulse beneath his boots. Elias's stomach clenched. This was no storm rider. It was a war party. Through the sheets of rain, dark figures appeared on the ridge, Apache warriors, faces painted, spears glinting in the last light. At their center rode the chief, broad-shouldered, draped in feathers and beads, his presence commanding even from a distance. He raised his arm, and the riders poured down the slope like a flood. Elias grabbed his rifle and shouted to the sisters. "Inside now!" But they did not move. They stood rooted, eyes fixed on their people, torn between kin and the man who had risked all for them. The first arrows hissed through the rain, splintering against the corral posts. Elias fired once, the shot cracking across the storm, but it was swallowed by thunder and drowned in the roar of charging hooves. The ranch was under siege. The storm broke in full fury. Rain hammered the earth, turning dust to mud. Lightning ripped the sky, throwing every figure into stark relief, the warriors circling, Elias at the gate, the sisters standing defiant at his side. He reloaded, hands shaking, vision blurred by water streaming from the brim of his hat. His lungs burned with each breath. Then came the fire. Torches, thrown high, caught the barn roof in an instant. Flames leapt skyward, orange against the black storm, sparks flying into the wind. Elias staggered back, the heat searing his face, his land, the last of his livelihood, consumed before his eyes. The younger sister cried out, running to the barn door, trying to save the horses trapped inside. Elias lunged after her, dragging her back, just as the roof caved in, timbers collapsing in a shower of sparks. The animals screamed, then silence. The loss cut like a knife, but there was no time to mourn. The chief rode forward through the chaos, rain streaming down his painted face. His eyes locked on Elias, burning with fury and judgment. With a gesture, the warriors stilled, circling but not striking. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the rolling thunder. Elias stood in the mud, chest heaving, rifle in hand, every muscle taut. He expected death in that moment, expected the chief's order, the storm of arrows that would pin him to the earth. Instead, the chief dismounted, stepping slowly through the rain, each stride heavy with power. He stopped only yards away, the firelight flickering across his face. The sisters moved then, stepping forward, placing themselves between Elias and the chief. Their defiance was a shield, their voices raised in their native tongue, sharp and urgent. Elias could not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. They would not see him slaughtered like an enemy. The chief's gaze shifted from them to Elias, who met it without lowering his weapon. The storm howled around them, tearing shingles from the cabin roof, hurling branches across the yard. But in that moment the world narrowed to two men, one who had taken, one who had lost, both bound by the same desert that judged all. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chief's raised hand. The warriors tightened their reins, waiting for his verdict. Elias's heart pounded, his legs trembling beneath him. His ranch was burning, his fortune gone, his fate no longer his own. And then the chief lowered his hand. No signal to strike, no call to kill, only silence. The warriors pulled back, their torches dying in the rain. The chief's eyes lingered on Elias, unreadable, before he turned away, mounting his horse once more. The storm swallowed them as they rode into the night, leaving fire, smoke, and ruin in their wake. Elias fell to his knees in the mud, the rifle slipping from his grasp. The barn smoldered, the corral lay broken, and the only light came from dying embers scattered across the yard. The sisters stood behind him, rain streaming down their faces, their breath ragged but steady. They had not fled, they had not abandoned him, but the cost was clear. The ranch was broken, his fortune lost. And the chief's judgment, though delayed, still hung heavy in the air like thunder waiting to strike again. The rain tapered off slowly, the storm dragging itself across the desert until only a whisper of thunder remained. Smoke curled from the blackened bones of the barn, and the once bright corral sagged in ruin. Elias Crow stayed kneeling in the mud, shoulders slumped, head bowed beneath the dripping brim of his hat. The rifle lay forgotten at his side, a useless piece of iron against the weight of what had just happened. The sisters stood close, their clothes clinging to their skin, their faces lit by the dim orange glow of smoldering timbers. For a long time, none of them moved. The silence after battle is heavier than gunfire, heavier than screams. It is the silence of men who know the ground has shifted beneath their feet. Elias finally pushed himself upright, his knees trembling. He looked around at the wreckage, at the dreams he had tried to build from dust and stubbornness. They were gone, burned, scattered, swallowed by the night. But in the eyes of the sisters, something flickered. Not pity, not fear, recognition. They had lost homes before, lost families, lost worlds that fire and steel had erased. Yet they still stood, proud and unbroken. And in that moment, Elias understood, ruin was not the end. It was the beginning of something forged in fire, stripped of weakness, hammered into strength. The weeks that followed were bitter. With no barn, no livestock, and half his tools ruined, Elias fought to keep the ranch from becoming nothing but ashes. Yet each morning, when he rose with the pale light, the sisters rose with him. Together they pulled charred beams from the rubble, salvaged nails from the wreckage, dug new post holes in the hardened ground. Their hands blistered, their backs bent under labor that would have broken lesser souls, but they did not falter. Sometimes, when the night fire burned low, Elias would see the elder sister hold out a silver trinket she wore around her neck, a necklace hammered from an old coin, passed down from her mother. She would rub it between her fingers, eyes far away, before slipping it back beneath her tunic. It was a reminder of where she had come from, of what could never be erased. Elias began to keep his wife's wedding band in his pocket, worn smooth by years of absence. When he touched it, he thought not of loss, but of the lives still tethered to him, here in the dust. 6 months passed. The desert rolled through another season, and with it came change. The ranch that had once been nothing but ruin stood again. A new barn rose, sturdier than before, its beams etched with markings, simple lines and shapes carved by the sisters as they worked, reminders of their people, their story. Elias did not stop them. He welcomed it. The corral held horses once more. The fields, against all odds, showed green shoots after a season of rain. Life had returned, not as it was, but as it was meant to be, rebuilt through hardship, bound by resilience. Dry Creek, too, had shifted. At first, townsfolk watched from a distance, whispering when Elias brought the sisters with him to trade. But whispers turned to silence, and silence to nods, and nods to cautious respect. Men who had once mocked him began to see not scandal, but strength, strength that endured when fire and fury tried to tear it down. Children watched with wide eyes as the sisters rode tall in the saddle, their presence commanding as any lawman. Even the saloon, once filled with cruel laughter at Elias's expense, grew quiet when he stepped through its doors. One evening near the first frost of winter, Elias stood with the sisters on the porch of the rebuilt cabin. The desert sky stretched above them, painted with crimson and violet, the air sharp with the promise of cold. Inside, the fire glowed steady, warmth spilling across the wooden floor. Elias placed his wife's wedding ring on the mantel that night, beside the silver necklace the elder sister had chosen to leave there, both tokens resting together in the firelight. 2 lives, 2 worlds, bound not by ownership, but by choice. As snow dusted the high peaks in the distance, Elias Crow felt a peace he had not known in years. The loneliness that had once carved him hollow was gone. In its place stood a bond forged in fire and blood, in loss and rebuilding, in the quiet resilience of those who refused to break. 1 year later, travelers passing through Dry Creek told of a ranch that had risen from ruin, run by a man who spent his fortune not on land or cattle, but on loyalty and honor. They spoke of 2 Apache women who stood as tall as any warrior, their pride unshaken, their dignity untouched. And they spoke of a rancher who had found not just survival, but a reason to endure. On the porch of that ranch, beneath the endless western sky, Elias Crow looked out across fields that once were barren and now breathed with life. The fire inside crackled. The carved beams above bore the marks of hands that refused to be erased, and the weight of the past had become the foundation of something new. If this story touched your heart, ride with us again across the untold trails of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe to keep the fire of these stories alive.